We're looking at how 19th century writers, and maybe particularly women writers, who are navigating that huge social shifts, used humor not just as a weapon, not just aggressively, but as a really sophisticated cultural device.
Okay, so how were they using it then?
Well, they were using it to manage these deep social and psychological conflicts. And the sources argue pretty convincingly, I think, that laughter was less about tearing things down and much more about creating this vital, constructive space for the individual self to actually survive and, well, grow.
I find that shift in perspective humor as constructive survival really compelling, especially when you think about the social structures back then, which often seemed designed to, well, trap the individual.
Exactly.
So to really set the stage for what this kind of humor looked like, maybe we should start with that perfect, almost baffling anecdote, the one from Marietta Holley.
Oh, Samantha Ellen. Yes, she's the ideal guide here. She's often portrayed as this woman of substantial presence, you know, both physically.
Right. Wasn't she described as quite large?
Yeah, over 200 pounds, they say.
Yeah.
But also morally, with principles weighty enough to match that physical stature. So in one scene, she encounters this woman who is just the physical embodiment of romantic, almost fatalistic misery. You know the type?
Oh, yeah. The complaining type. Totally. She's complaining dramatically about her existential suffering, crying out that her sore female heart pants for freedom. It is sore and it pants. Just laying it on thick.
The picture of the frail, sentimental heroine, consumed by feeling, very Victorian.
Absolutely. And Samantha Allen, she just observes this woman's physical state, noting her impossibly cinched waist, described almost clinically as not much bigger than a pipe's tail.
Yeah.
Which was a common look, even celebrated, you know?
Right, the tiny waist ideal.
Yeah. So Samantha's response, delivered in this almost clinical yet kind of motherly tone, is to just cut right through the melodrama. She addresses the physical reality.
What does she say?
She asks with just utter sincerity, when your heart felt sore and panting, did you ever loosen your corset strings?
Did you ever loosen your corset strings? Wow. It's devastating, but also genuinely caring, isn't it?
It is. It feels revolutionary in that moment.
Yeah.
And the sources we're looking at argue it perfectly captures the complexity we're trying to, dissect today.
So how does it capture that complexity?
Well, okay, it's funny, right? Because of the immediate shift from this high-minded suffering to just physiological reality.
Yeah, the deflation is instant.
But look closer.
Right.
It's simultaneously promoting women's rights, suggesting political freedom starts with bodily freedom.
Okay, I see that.
It's gently satirizing Samantha's own literal-mindedness, too, which is part of her charm. And maybe most importantly, it's launching this devastating critique of 19th century body standards, the standards that compelled women toward physical repression, a process we now maybe recognize as encouraging disorders like anorexia.
And if we try to, force that joke into our standard analytical boxes, it doesn't quite fit, does it?
It really resists. It's not simply a Freudian joke about veiled sexual repression, because the repression is right there on the surface. The corsetry, it's literal,
Right.
and the hostility.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be aggressive toward a specific class enemy. So the Hobbesian model, sudden glory from conflict and superiority, that falls short too.
So who is the target, if not the woman?
It seems to be the cultural standard itself, the thing that restricts her.
Okay.
The central point the source material makes is that Holley's comedy isn't grounded in just aggressively negating patriarchal privilege. It's more about an exaltation and possibilities for self-satisfaction and improvement. She's pointing toward liberation.
Ah, so that's the constructive angle.
Exactly. This is why we're arguing for this new central thesis. 19th century humor, especially from women writers, often focused on finding common creative ground. It posits humor as a kind of necessary madness.
Necessary madness. I like that.
Yeah. It liberates people from the strictures of what was often deemed relentless sanity, It exposes the limitations of the reigning orthodoxies of behavior and thought.
So we're embarking on a deep dive to see how these writers turned cultural constraints into these comedic opportunities for mental liberation. Let's start with where those constraints came from. The invention of the modern middle-class home.
Right. The entire foundation, really, of 19th century humor rests on managing this, seismic cultural shift that started back in the late 18th century, the rise of the middle-class ideology of domesticity.
And this wasn't just a minor tweak, right? It was a full-on revolution against the established order.
Oh, absolutely. The previous order was what we'd call the Calvinist patriarchy.
Okay, what did that look like?
Well, that old structure was based on a fixed, rigid, God-established hierarchy. Your place was defined by birth, And authority, political, religious, domestic, flowed straight down from God through the father.
And control was maintained how? Discipline.
Pretty much. Discipline, not necessarily love or emotional connection in the way we think of it now. Hierarchy was key.
Okay, so then this new ideology comes along, sentimental liberalism, and it asserts something pretty radical. Every individual is morally equal, a free agent, regardless of birthright.
Exactly. Which raises a huge question. If you reject traditional hierarchical authority, how does society maintain control?
Good question.
It had to shift the locus of control completely. Since individuals are free, social stability couldn't rely on coercive authority anymore. It had to rely solely on affectional bonds, love, connection.
And that's what elevates the nuclear family.
Precisely. It instantly makes the nuclear family the primary social unit, the central engine of the republic. The thinking was, if you want an educated, morally trustworthy populace, the building blocks of democracy, you have to nurture them in the home.
Which is why the home suddenly takes on this almost mythic status. And this shift coincided directly with the rise of industrial capitalism, didn't it? When work started moving out of the home.
Correct. Productive labor was rapidly moving out of the household into the factory, the market. So the domestic ideology then had to articulate a crucial non-economic function for the home.
And that function was?
It defined the domestic space as the haven in a heartless world. It was meant to be the counterpoint, the spiritual refuge designed to repair the psychic damage. The brutal competitiveness, the moral compromise inflicted on men working in the world of individualism and commerce.
And this drastically redefined the woman's role, too. She wasn't just an inferior economic laborer anymore.
No, she became an equal partner, theoretically, but confined to a separate sphere, one dedicated purely to influence, kindness, spiritual value, raising the kids. She was the moral compass, the stabilizing force.
Or supposed to be.
The problem, though, and this is the massive internal contradiction that the humorists had to grapple with, is that this beautiful rhetoric of sentimental equality was kind of flawed right from the start, philosophically speaking. You mentioned Francis Hutcheson.
Exactly. Hutcheson is a key figure here because the paradox is rooted in ideas like his. He was trying to maximize individual liberty, and he asserted fundamental human equality, really radical ideas for the time.
So where did he stumble when applying that to the domestic sphere?
Well, Hutcheson was committed to this idea of a contractual society, rejecting traditional patriarchal governing rights. He defined marriage as a contractual partnership. It sounds good, right? Sounds progressive.
But when he tried to reconcile individual freedom with social necessity, he focused intensely on the need for stable procreation. Raising children became the central issue.
Okay.
He argued that the primary natural limitation on individual freedom was the constraint required to raise children within that small family unit.
And by defining the stability of that nuclear unit as the ultimate social necessity, he basically ended up relegating the mothers, the ones mainly responsible for procreation, to that fixed domestic sphere.
Precisely. So the rhetoric promoted the family as the source of individual freedom and moral development.
Yeah.
Yet that same rhetoric created these massive, rigid constraints within the supposedly free contractual marriage unit. The sources argue that the family, intended as this ultimate sanctuary of freedom, paradoxically became the essential organ of social control that the individual must resist.
Wow. That is the ultimate tension, isn't it? Being told the home is your spiritual, moral haven, the source of liberty, while simultaneously experiencing it as this restrictive psychological cage where your responsibilities became so narrowly fixed. It's a total cognitive trap.
And if you take that tension seriously, you really can't maintain relentless sanity, as the sources put it. A deep ambivalence, that clash between the ideal and the reality. That's why humor flourishes.
Ah, okay.
It became the essential technique for exploring that contested ground, for venting those conflicted feelings, and finding a renewed sense of individual vitality. Laughter was like the pressure release valve that kept the whole system from just exploding.
So humor allowed both men and women to manage the emotional, maybe even political fallout of this new domestic ideology. It was the necessary madness that let them recognize and negotiate the limits of this beautiful sounding, but actually rigidly restrictive cultural ideal.
Exactly. It was about survival.
Okay, so let's move from that abstract tension to some specific real-life conflicts that define the period, starting with the clash between individualism and community property.
Right. If you're a liberal society championing the individual, you have to draw clear lines, right? Where does oneself end and another begin?
Yeah.
And property becomes the physical manifestation of that border.
Makes sense.
And few writers delineated those borders through comedy better than Caroline Kirkland, especially in her frontier sketches. A New Home Will Follow.
Ah, Kirkland. She moved from New York to the Michigan frontier.
Yeah, from relative stability to the raw frontier.
Yeah.
And her narrator immediately encounters this shocking breakdown of personal property rights. It's quite funny, but also, deeply unsettling for her.
She talks about virtual communism, doesn't she? Where neighbors just borrow everything.
Everything. It's not mutual. It's one-sided and relentless. The neighbors feel entitled to constantly borrow everything from basic kitchen stuff like kettles and pans to entire beds.
Wow.
And the reason they give is just because you've got plenty, which is totally invasive, right?
Completely. It erases any sense of personal boundary.
And Kirkland uses humor to show the absolute terror of losing the self in this communal chaos. There's that anecdote about a neighbor asking to borrow her husband's shaving apparatus and his pantaloons.
His pantaloons. Okay, that's the breaking point.
Definitely. This isn't just about sharing anymore. It's about erasing the physical and proprietary borders of the individual self.
So the humor in Kirkland's work isn't just like mocking the lack of manners on the frontier, which some critics might say.
No, it's much deeper. It's a serious defense of the self. The narrator constantly uses possessive pronouns, my broom, my thread, my husband, to desperately draw that line, to define her individual unit of ownership and autonomy.
She's fighting for the principle that property isn't just about economics, it's the buffer you need between your defined self and this overwhelming, absorbing society.
Exactly. It shows that to fully embrace individualism, you first need to define my. If your neighbor can borrow your property, maybe they can borrow your identity too. And humor is the weapon she uses to defend that crucial boundary.
Okay, so while Kirkland is defending the borders of the family unit, other humorists saw the family itself, specifically marriage, as the ultimate limitation on individual freedom, which brings us to the anti-matrimonial satires.
Yes, these were incredibly popular. And they really voiced that deep ambivalence surrounding the contractual nature of marriage, which we were just talking about. You had writers like Joseph C. Neal, whose irony was just biting.
How did he frame it?
He framed the marriage dynamic not in terms of sentimental affection, like the ideology said, but in the terms of the old rejected hierarchy, power and submission.
He used those dark, ironic metaphors, right? Like the one about authority and obedience being
The knife and fork of this extensive banquet, the world.
Yeah.
That phrase is just a total rejection of sentimental liberalism.
It really is.
Neal's suggesting that, in reality, marriage just reestablishes a kind of feudal order. If some are born to command the husband, who still held legal power, then others must submit, meaning the wife.
And the humor comes from him presenting the state of affairs with such obvious distaste that it just undermines the whole supposed sanctity of the union.
Exactly. It's a recognition that the marriage contract severely limits that free moral agency promised by sentimental liberalism.
And then you had Fanny Fern, writing from the female perspective, pushing that aggression even further. She didn't hold back at all.
No, she did not. She declared that love is a farce, matrimony is a humbug, husbands are domestic Napoleons, Neros, Alexanders, sighing for other hearts to conquer after they are sure of yours.
Wow. Domestic Napoleons. That's strong language.
Deliberately hyperbolic, yeah. She uses these military and dictatorial terms, Napoleons, Neros, to strip away that sentimental veneer of the domestic haven and expose the marital relationship as basically a political power struggle.
So the common thread uniting Neal and Fern is this fierce insistence on individual freedom.
I think so. They attacked marriage because both spouses, the husband as the legal authority, and maybe even the wife as the demanding moral authority, were seen as a fundamental limitation on the individual's expansive, free identity.
Okay, let's shift to our second conflict. Commerce versus Christian virtue. This new domestic ideology positioned men as like morally corrupted by the market.
Right.
And women as these moral paragons protecting the home. But capitalism immediately complicated that neat little split, didn't it?
It really did. Because the non-economic role assigned to women, the caretaker, quickly merged with the capitalistic imperative of the spender.
Ah, the idea of conspicuous consumption.
Exactly. Thorstein Veblen would nail this later. The woman's job, in a way, became displaying the husband's financial success and status through the household's expense and fashion. And this directly collided with those traditional Republican and Christian virtues of simplicity, thrift, moral modesty.
So the tension is that the moral center of the home was now tied up with market status. You see this satirized brilliantly in the Potiphar Papers, right?
Oh yeah, that satire focuses on the wealthy New York social elite. Old Potiphar, the husband, he's constantly railing against their extravagant lifestyle, the expensive parties, the spoiled furniture, the sheer pretension of their social circle.
He complains about the wine, doesn't he?
He does. He specifically complains that his guests drink my Margot and Lafitte, and who don't know Chambertin from licorice water. He's upset that the expense is wasted on people who don't appreciate the sort of Republican quality of the goods. It's not just about the money.
But his wife, Mrs. Potiphar, whom he calls the natural projector, she just dismisses his complaints.
Instantly. She explains that they simply cannot reduce their style of living. Why? For fear of being accused of meanness, or worse, signaling to the world that their affairs are in a poor state. Appearances are everything.
That fear of being judged for meanness, that's the cultural pivot point, isn't it?
It really highlights how the domestic sphere had become an extension of the market, where social virtue was measured by conspicuous display, by the successful deployment of wealth, rather than the spiritual value the ideology promised. The wife is locked into this role, compelled to spend to maintain the family's economic reputation.
And Marietta Holley, bringing back Samantha Allen, she approached this from a deeply Christian angle, right?
Yes, she did. She didn't attack the spending itself so much as the system that forced women into economic dependence in the first place, compelling them to become these lavish spenders just to validate their husband's wealth.
So Holley used humor to argue that the dependence itself was morally degrading.
Right. It showed that whether you approach the domestic sphere from the angle of Republican simplicity or Christian virtue or just plain financial common sense, the reality that money and status governed the emotional center of the family was this shared, fertile source of comedy.
And the humor is unifying because it criticizes the systemic contradictions, not just the individuals trapped within them.
Well put, yeah.
Okay, now for the third and probably most sensitive conflict, passion versus repression. Specifically talking about sexuality inside this supposedly pure domestic haven.
Right. Victorian ideology was really predicated on this severe splitting of sexual roles. Men were seen as, well, lusty because earthly, while women were supposedly passionless because more nearly inclined to the divine.
Which sounds like a recipe for massive structural sexual repression.
It absolutely was. And humor became one of the few avenues where these dark, sort of subterranean family dynamics could be safely examined. Herman Melville, in particular, used this dark, unsettling humor to resist the myth of the home as purely a place of spiritual discipline.
Let's spend some real time on Melville's story, I and My Chimney. The sources suggest it's a deeply veiled but brilliant critique of the 19th century family structure. We hear the chimney functions as a phallic symbol. What does that really mean in the context of the narrator's devotion to it?
Okay, so the chimney, it's huge, massive girth, enormous primeval brick foundation. It represents more than just potency, though that's part of it. It symbolizes the narrator's essential earthy spirituality.
The spirituality.
Yeah, his rooted connection to mortality, to primal passion, the basic untamed aspects of being a man in nature. He's literally clinging to this massive, immovable object in the center of his house, defining his very identity by it.
And then in steps his wife, who he also calls the natural projector. That term seems to be doing a lot of work here.
It really is. It's not just that she's ambitious in a normal way. She seems to embody the aggressive modern spirit of improvement and, crucially, denial.
Denial of what?
Denial of limits, denial of nature, denial of mortality. She represents the full force of 19th century capitalistic and sentimental culture pressing in on the home. Her stated maxim is actually kind of chilling. Whatever is wrong. And what is more must be altered. And what is still more must be altered right away.
Wow. No room for just letting things be.
None. The sources argue she represents the drive for convenience, style, and most dangerously, the denial of reality. She wages war against all natural limits, including the inevitable limit of death.
And her campaign is specifically directed at this massive, immovable chimney. She wants to tear it out.
She plots incessantly to tear it out, to make the house stylish and convenient. She proposes renovations that will inevitably expose the foundational core of the narrator's identity, this thing he clings to.
So the remodeling effort, the sources read that as an attempt to metaphorically castrate the man.
Right. And by extension, it reflects the cultural fear that male passion, which was associated with vitality, sure, but also inevitably with mortality, actually depleted men of their energy. It was seen as dangerous.
Yep.
The wife, who seems to never acknowledge her own death, represents this capitalistic culture, trying to repress feelings, trying to avoid the essential understanding of mortality that comes with acknowledging passion.
So the humor is born from this grotesque, really dark conflict between his primal need to acknowledge mortality, embodied by the chimney, and her relentless, shallow drive for modernization and denial, which she calls convenience.
Exactly. But the key thing in the story is that resistance doesn't lead to freedom for him. It actually drives him kind of mad.
How so?
Well, Melville shows that when passion and mortality are denied and repressed like this, the result is spiritually debilitating. The narrator becomes this defensive recluse, hiding near his chimney foundation, fighting his wife, his children. He's isolated.
So denial only leads to antagonism.
Yeah, antagonism is boorish self-defensiveness, as one source puts it. His ultimate message seems pretty clear. True faith in life requires reading religious and cultural symbols correctly, understanding our own inner life, our sexual relation to others, rather than just etherealizing those impulses out of fear of mortality.
And humor, in this case, is the dark lens that lets us see the devastating consequences of that repression. It's not light humor at all.
Not at all. It's deeply unsettling.
That discussion of Melville, wow, it really segues beautifully into how humor functions as this cognitive release, doesn't it? Providing necessary psychological distance when social or personal tragedy just becomes overwhelming.
Right. When the system fails you or the ideals fail you, humor can be the tool that resets the mind. And we see this so vividly in the creative crisis of Washington Irving.
Irving's early life, it was kind of the embodiment of the failed promise of domesticity, wasn't it?
In many ways, yes. He was this pampered, genteel son, protected by his family's wealth, but then his fiancée died suddenly. And the illusion of the home as this stable, eternal haven was just shattered. But the real blow, perhaps, came when his family business collapsed.
Right, plunging him into debt. And he was this conservative gentleman who felt writing for money was sort of beneath him.
Exactly. So he's financially ruined, emotionally shattered, forced to become a professional writer abroad, the very drudgery he felt he was too refined for. He was spiraling into this profound despondency. Apparently couldn't write.
And he was forced to produce these sentimental sketches that basically upheld the very beliefs that had so dramatically disappointed him. That's ironic.
Deeply ironic. For 2 years, he was mentally paralyzed. But then the sources describe this galvanic moment in 1818. He was reminiscing with his brother-in-law about old times in Sleepy Hollow.
Okay.
And suddenly he just found himself laughing uncontrollably. Like really laughing.
Just out of the blue.
Seemingly. And this release was like the intellectual equivalent of breaking a fever. He immediately fled to his room, and apparently thoughts just came rushing faster than he could write them.
Wow.
The ice of his mental despondency broke, and right then he produced the first chapters of Rip Van Winkle.
So laughter itself was the chemical catalyst, the thing that unlocked his creativity again.
It seems that way. And the character he creates, Rip, he embodies all the things Irving most feared becoming, right? An idle, hen-pecked failure, terrified of the demanding, economically focused wife, Dame Van Winkle.
Who sounds a bit like Mrs. Potiphar or Melville's wife, in a way.
There's definitely a type emerging, isn't there? So the creation of Rip was his way of managing his own untenable social pressures. He achieved this vital psychological distance by creating this exaggerated version of his fears and then sort of partially denying his own identification with him.
Which leads to the critical debate about Rip Van Winkle, right? Is it just a simple moralizing tale promoting childish escape and, ignoring your responsibilities?
That's one reading. Or is the humor functioning as a deeper, more sophisticated tool, a way to achieve distance from impossible societal expectations?
Given Irving's personal circumstances, it seems hard to dismiss that second reading. The fact that his writing resumed not in sober reflection, but in this sudden burst of laughter, it suggests the humor itself was the necessary prerequisite for the story.
Yeah, it was the mind finding a way to safely process trauma, perhaps.
Okay, so if Irving used humor for creative distance, Fanny Fern used it more like a proactive antidote. An antidote to pain and what she fiercely denounced as excessive sensibility.
Yes, she was really against that. She claimed, quite dramatically actually, that she used laughter to ward off the very thought of suicide. For her, humor was an active defense mechanism.
And how did she translate that defense into, practical advice for domestic life? She advocates disruption and vigorous teasing, doesn't she, rather than passive sympathy?
She does. In her column, Don't Disturb Him, she tells wives specifically not to indulge their husbands' bad moods with sympathy. She thought that just reinforces the melancholy.
So what should they do instead?
She instructs them to tease him, to disrupt his seriousness vigorously. She uses phrases like, "I wouldn't stop teasing him for the great mogul till I had shortened his long face to my liking. Just keep at it."
That is pretty radical advice for the era of the haven in a heartless world. She's basically insisting that the sentimental piece of the home is actually bad for your health.
Precisely. She argues that vigorous teasing, even if it annoys the husband initially, gives his melancholy blood a good, healthful start, restoring his good mood and health faster than sentimental coddling.
So active, disruptive humor is better than the stupid bit of advice to let him alone.
That's her argument. It's a mechanism for demanding reciprocity and vitality in the relationship. Don't just let him sulk.
And we see this defensive humor applied to fighting household tyranny, too, in the anecdote about our first nurse, which, yeah, a lot of new parents can probably relate to.
Oh, absolutely. The arrival of the first baby brings not joy, in her telling, but the tyranny of the nurse. The nurse immediately supplants the husband, banishes him to a desolate spare chamber, and completely infantilizes the wife.
So the nurse imposes this authoritarian order on the supposedly reciprocal family unit.
Exactly. And the humor, then, is the act of resistance. The narrator and her husband conspire together, secretly, to undermine the nurse's authority until she finally leaves.
And when the nurse leaves?
The wife reports, "She was so glad when she went that I laughed till I cried."
That cathartic laughter again.
It's crucial. It's the mechanism for throwing off the oppressive seriousness and authority imposed on the new family unit. It restores the shared power and reciprocity of the marriage. It's a way to process the outrage and pain, transforming what could have been a deeply upsetting experience into a shared cathartic joke between the couple.
Okay. Finally, let's turn to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, she's someone you might think of as a deeply serious moralist, right? Maybe not immediately associate her with comedy.
True. But she utilized humor extensively, and she framed it as a necessary spiritual discipline, a kind of controlled catharsis.
Why did she need that catharsis? What was she wrestling with?
Enormous theological and psychological conflicts. She was terrified of the rigidity of Calvinist repression, exemplified by someone like Jonathan Edwards. She saw it as a psychic disaster, especially for spiritual women.
But she was also afraid of
Unbridled sexual passion. She was equally afraid of that. So humor became her intellectual safety net. It was a catharsis that made the inherent anxieties of life tolerable by providing this controlled release from seriousness and decorum.
And she recognized that even the most devout people needed this release.
Yes. She noted that even the Old Town ministers must be allowed their laugh and joke, sin and Satan to the contrary notwithstanding. Even they needed a break.
And this need for controlled mirth is personified by the character Tina in Old Town Folks, right?
Exactly. Tina, one of the orphans in the story, functions as this disruptor of the rigid ceremonial order. She could mimic and sing and dance and fling back joke for joke in a perfect meteoric shower. She's the vital, unruly element in this deeply structured, pious household.
And her laughter was actually redemptive, even for the really repressed characters.
Apparently so. It was powerful enough to break through the emotional armor of the most repressed characters, like the minister's wife and Aunt Lois. Stowe writes they would last till the tears roll down their cheeks and their ancient whalebone stays creaked.
Their ancient whalebone stays creaked. That image is just perfect.
Isn't it? It perfectly symbolizes the physical and moral rigidity, just giving way under the pressure of authentic, vital humor.
So humor provided Stowe a necessary, safe space to address really problematic themes. Things she associated with the Lady Byron scandal, like incestuous desire or the servitude of marriage.
Yes. It allowed her to approach these dangerous themes by filtering them through a sort of quaint humor. It softened the sharp edges of her own moralistic anxieties, letting her address them without completely succumbing to her fear of passion itself.
So across Irving, Fern, and Stowe, we're really seeing humor as this incredibly versatile psychological tool, a mechanism for distance, disruption, and discipline, all designed to combat these cultural forces that threaten to just paralyze the individual mind.
Precisely. It was about maintaining flexibility. Okay, so this expensive evidence, covering everything from Kirkland's defense of property lines to Melville's really dark domestic satire, it brings us right back to the theoretical challenge we started with.
Which is?
If humor is functioning as creative release, psychological distance, spiritual discipline, then the traditional theories that insist on viewing laughter primarily through the lens of aggression just seem, well, insufficient.
Right. Let's revisit those traditional aggressive models. The Hobbesian model is the big one, right? Sudden glory is the passion which maketh those grimaces called laughter.
That's the foundation for the superiority theory. Basically, laughter comes purely from feeling intellectually or morally superior to the object of the joke. You laugh at someone or something.
And this model really dominated Western thought for centuries, didn't it?
It did. And even when critics started looking at this huge body of 19th century women's writing, they often just defaulted back to this aggressive framework. Critics like Nancy Walker often framed female humor almost exclusively as subversive aggression.
Like a passive-aggressive attack on the patriarchy.
Kind of, yeah. And while aggression is certainly part of humor, we can't deny that the sources we've explored today suggest it just doesn't account for that feeling of release or empathy or the creativity we were just discussing with Irving.
Okay, and this is where we need to look really carefully at Freud. Because even Freud, whose work on jokes is often cited as proof that humor is disguised aggression.
Yeah.
He made a crucial distinction that often gets overlooked, right?
Absolutely. This is key. Freud's book on jokes, Der Witz und seine Beziehung zum unbewussten Jokes, and their relation to the unconscious focuses primarily on fits, which are jokes involving hostility or obscenity, usually.
Okay.
The purpose of wits, according to Freud, is to release repressed aggression or illicit sexual desire by cleverly circumventing the ego's critical faculty, the censor. The laughter is often sharp. It comes from a sudden release of psychic energy that would otherwise be used for repression.
So Witz is about saving psychic energy by expressing something forbidden, basically. But he wrote a separate essay just called Humor, didn't he? How is that different?
Yes, and it describes a fundamentally different psychodynamic. The laughter generated by humor, in Freud's view, is gentle, reflective. It often involves a measure of self-recognition or empathy.
How does it work psychologically?
It occurs when the superego, the moral and critical authority in the mind, like the inner parent, intervenes to solace the ego, the sense of self. It effectively minimizes a potential threat or misfortune.
So instead of the ego being overwhelmed by, say, hardship or anxiety, the superego steps in and says,
Something like, look, this moment's difficult, sure, but in the grand scheme of things, your distress is tiny and all its interests are pretty trivial. It puts things in perspective, but in a kind, almost parental way.
Ah, okay. So humor, in this sense, becomes this complex defense mechanism. It helps the healthy mind evade suffering without resorting to madness, which Freud equated with neurosis or delusion.
Precisely. It's the ultimate recognition that reality is difficult, yeah, but our mental frameworks are flexible enough to manage it. It's a way of recognizing a limitation and simultaneously transcending it emotionally. And this aligns perfectly with that idea of necessary madness we talked about earlier. The humor allows the 19th century writer to put the relentlessly serious world in temporary abeyance.
This search for critical nuance, moving beyond just a single aggressive definition, it leads us naturally into the domain of pragmatism and critical pluralism, doesn't it? Thinkers like William James, Richard Rorty.
Yeah, exactly. Pragmatism fundamentally resists the idea that there's one single transcendental objectivity, one right way to see things. It recognizes that our perception is always filtered through our conscious and unconscious paradigms, our frameworks.
So the critical task isn't just to find the one single truth about humor.
No. It's not just about pointing out the limitations of a theory like Hobbes's. It's about achieving a critical pluralism, seeing how each different theory answers a different but still valid question about human experience.
Okay, so we're not saying Hobbes is totally wrong.
Not necessarily. Hobbes might answer the question, where does raw aggression find release in laughter?
Right.
While Freud's concept of humor, and the examples from the 19th century writers we've seen, answer a different question. How does the individual survive systemic contradiction without losing their sanity?
They're answering different questions. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly. And this requires us to look not just at psychological dynamics, but maybe even at the brain itself. Our sources bring in modern cognitive science here, specifically Gerald Edelman's work on neural organization, to try and explain what humor is doing on a physical, biological level.
Okay, the neurobiological angle. Edelman views the mind not as a static filing cabinet, but as this dynamic process, always maximizing flexibility within its genetic constraints.
Right. He talks about the brain creating these complex neural maps, which are constantly competing and adjusting based on new input from the world.
And the central conflict in the brain, according to him, is between two crucial values.
Yeah, diversity, the ability to absorb new input, create new mental possibilities, adapt and consistency, the ability to retain stable, functional categories, old ways of thinking that work. We need stability to function day to day, but we need diversity to adapt and grow.
So where does humor fit into that dynamic?
The moment of humor occurs when there's a collision between those two values. When our established conceptual map of reality clashes irrevocably with the reality of lived experience.
You mean when life as we've abstracted, it collides with life as we actually live it?
Exactly. That cognitive dissonance, that unexpected mismatch, that is the neural moment of humor. The brain detects an incongruity.
And what does the humor do in that moment?
The humor seems to serve as this neutral, safe space to reevaluate these conflicting constructions of reality. The brain sees the collision, maybe realizes the old category or expectation is inadequate in this instance, and laughs, which signals a kind of harmless error or a need for adjustment.
So it allows the mind to embrace dissonance, to hold two contradictory ideas simultaneously without suffering paralysis.
That's the idea. This capacity for remapping, this instantaneous psychological flexibility, is the core value of humor that allowed those 19th-century writers to survive the intense paradoxes of the domestic haven we discussed.
Wow. That psychological flexibility and the synthesis of maybe aggression and empathy, it seems perfectly encapsulated in the work of Mary Wilkins Freeman, which leads us to what the sources call the pathos of comedy.
Freeman's genius really was her ability to achieve this delicate balancing act. Particularly in her stories about repressed New England village life, her characters are often defined by rigid, obsessive behavior, but she uses exaggeration and absurdity to safely access the painful underlying truths of their lives without making us just dismiss them.
Right. Think of a New England nun, Louisa Ellis. She's the absolute picture of hyper-ordered, repressed domesticity.
Totally. She meticulously guards her space, covers her sexual organs with that Chinese box of aprons.
Which is such a striking image.
Isn't it? And she keeps her dog, Caesar, chained up and fed only corn cakes for 14 years, turning him into this almost grotesque metaphor for her own repressed sexuality and her deep fear of disorder.
But the extremity of Louisa's neurotic behavior, the aprons, the chained dog, it's set up as comic and absurd, but somehow it's never contemptible.
Exactly. The absurdity makes the pain of her repression accessible safely for the reader. We might chuckle at the situation, but we recognize the genuine tragedy underlying it.
And Freeman pulls off a similar move in A Village Singer, right? The story's full of painful humiliation and petty village feuds.
Very petty. But the absurdity, like the proud main character, Candace, taking her commemorative gift album, which was given to her right after she was publicly humiliated, and using it as a footstool.
Yeah.
It elevates the pain into the realm of the ridiculous, making it bearable to look at.
And the ultimate insight in Freeman's work, according to the sources, comes near the end of that story, when a bystander observes Marcus.
Right, Marcus, a character who has been forced by his wife to submit to her, demands all story.
Yeah.
He finally refuses this small, almost foolish act of stubborn pride. He refuses to sit meekly on the church steps like she told him to.
He just stands up straight like a man and walks into the church.
And at that moment, the bystanders realized they had been watching absurdity, yes, but they also recognized that they had felt the pathos in the comedy.
Ah, the pathos in the comedy. That is the perfect synthesis, isn't it?
It really is. The humor enables the reader to feel the deep underlying sadness of human conflict and inadequacy. But it transforms the initial aggressive judgment, that Hobbesian sudden glory of the laugh, into empathy and understanding.
It allows the absurdity of human conflict to become understandable and, crucially, manageable.
Exactly. The humor doesn't erase the conflict. It just gives us the mental distance, the flexibility to bear witness to it without being destroyed by it. It's arguably the highest form of psychological flexibility. Hashtag tag out outro.
Wow. We've covered a tremendous amount of intellectual and emotional ground today, spanning philosophy, social history, psychology, even cognitive science.
We really have.
And it seems abundantly clear that 19th century humor was far, far from just trivial entertainment or, mere aggression.
No, instead, it functioned as this crucial survival mechanism, a way to cope with the conflicting demands of modern life back then.
It was a creative release for someone like Irving.
Right, a sharp defense mechanism for Fanny Fern.
A form of necessary spiritual discipline for Stowe.
and a vital tool for establishing individual space against these overwhelming social and moral pressures for writers like Kirkland or even Melville in his dark way.
And maybe most importantly, it forces us to challenge that prevailing view that laughter must always be rooted in superiority.
Yeah, instead it points toward this concept of humor rooted in psychological flexibility, the necessary madness we talked about.
Right.
The thing that allows the mind to embrace cognitive dissonance when our idealized categories of thought collide head-on with the undeniable reality of lived experience.
And if we circle back to that core suggestion from the source material, that true faith in life means embracing reality, all of it, including mortality and sexuality, rather than repressing those impulses out of fear, we see a really powerful conclusion emerging. If the symbols of religion and culture are ultimately just, as one source put it, marks of the psyche, constantly being updated and adjusted, does the capacity to laugh at those very marks, to engage in that necessary madness, does that represent maybe the clearest possible connection we have to our inner truth and vitality?
That is definitely something to mull over, isn't it? It reframes laughter entirely.
It really does. So maybe a final thought for you listening. Where in your own life might you need a dose of that necessary madness? A way to liberate yourself from self-imposed constraints or categories that maybe no longer serve your reality?
Good question.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.